when one of the most beloved actors in American history walked into a small jewelry store on a quiet street in Bronxville, New York, just to buy an anniversary gift for the woman who had stood beside him for 41 years, and a man in a navy suit crossed the marble floor and told him, very politely, that he would need to step outside until the store had an appropriate window to assist him. No cameras, no bodyguards, no assistant. Just a 69-year-old man in a charcoal gray wool sweater, standing under a chandelier of cut crystal, looked at and dismissed before he had spoken his own name. Here is what you need to understand before this story moves another inch. The man in that sweater had 2 gold Oscar statues sitting on a bookshelf back home in Toluca Lake. He had a degree in journalism from Fordham University and had donated over $3 million to that school alone. He had given $2 more million to a small historically black college in Texas called Wiley College to bring back their debate team. He had served as the national spokesman for the Boys and Girls Clubs of America for 32 consecutive years. And none of that, not a single piece of it, registered with the man in the navy suit who walked across that floor and asked him to leave. So what do you do in that moment? What do you do when a stranger looks at the entire shape of a life you have spent 70 years building, decides in roughly 4 seconds that none of it matters, and asks you to wait on the sidewalk like a man waiting for a bus? Do you raise your voice? Do you make the kind of phone call that a man with that kind of name in his pocket could absolutely make? Do you let the camera in your head start filming the moment you will tell on television 3 months from now? Denzel Washington did none of those things. He did something much quieter than that, something much slower, something built from a sermon his father had preached 46 years ago in a small Pentecostal church in Mount Vernon, New York, when Denzel was 12 years old and didn't yet understand what was being said. There was a young man in that store, a 21-year-old theater student from Mount Vernon named Elijah Mensah, whose father had once been turned away from the same counter 3 years before, and who would make a decision in that quiet room that he had spent every day of those 3 years preparing himself to make, even though he didn't know it yet. There was an old Italian widow on the velvet bench by the back wall, a woman named Helen Vaccaro, whose late husband had been a New York City police officer for 41 years, and who saw what was happening with the clarity of someone who had watched 1,000 small injustices and remembered everyone. And there was a holding company filing made in Wilmington, Delaware, 16 weeks after that Saturday afternoon, signed in a hand that one financial reporter at the Westchester Journal-News would recognize because she had once interned with the man who signed it. What that filing said, what Denzel Washington had quietly purchased in those 16 weeks, and what happened when a man named Whitmore Halsey III walked into a boardroom not knowing who was already sitting in it, is the story I am about to tell you. Stay with me until the very end, because the last 5 minutes of this story will land harder than the first 5. I promise you that. The bell above the door at Halsey Brothers Jewelers had a particular sound. A small brass instrument that had been hanging on the same nail since 1862, when Cornelius Halsey first opened the door to the public on a June morning. By June of 2024, that bell had announced the arrival of 3 presidents, 2 Saudi princes, a sitting Supreme Court justice, and roughly 412,000 other customers who had walked through to spend a portion of money that most of America would never see in a lifetime. It rang at 3:47 on a Saturday afternoon, and the air inside the store changed. Pondfield Road in Bronxville, on a June Saturday, is one of the more pleasant streets in the country. 2 miles north of the Bronx, 2 miles south of Mount Vernon, the kind of village that looks like a postcard of itself. Stone facades with copper trim. Window boxes spilling with white begonias. The smell of lavender drifting out of a soap shop 3 doors down. A bookshop owner sweeping his stoop. A woman walking a small gray dog. The sound of church bells from Christ Church, Bronxville, a few blocks over, ringing the 3/4 hour. Halsey Brothers occupied the corner lot at 72 Pondfield Road. Its windows held a single watch each, lit from below by tiny pinpoint lamps. The carpeting inside was a dense, almost soundless wool the color of a winter sky. The ceiling was paneled in walnut. A chandelier of cut Bohemian crystal hung in the center of the room. Glass display cases stretched along 3 walls, each one a small museum of restraint. Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin. Elang and Son. Pieces of jewelry resting on cream velvet, each priced with a small card that gave a number and nothing else, no dollar sign, as though the dollar sign would have been vulgar. The man who walked through the door was 6 feet tall and weighed 194 pounds. He had gray-white hair cut short and a beard the color of slate. He wore a charcoal gray crewneck sweater of plain merino wool, dark khaki trousers, brown leather Oxford shoes that were broken in but cared for, and a pair of reading glasses on a thin tortoise-shell cord around his neck. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no phone in his hand. He had a slight stiffness in his left knee from an old basketball injury that he had never gotten fixed. Behind him, holding the door for half a second longer than necessary, was a compact man in his early 50s named Curtis Beaumont. Curtis was a former United States Navy sailor from Lafayette, Louisiana, who had worked as a driver for the man in the sweater for 11 years, and who had the very specific stillness of someone whose entire job had been to read rooms before the people in noticed they were being read. Curtis stepped back outside and stood by the black SUV at the curb. He did not come in. He never came in. He had been instructed many years ago that his presence inside a store changed the air, and the man in the sweater did not want air changed for him. So the man in the sweater walked alone toward the third display case from the door. He bent down slightly, which he did not have to do, because he wanted to see the necklace at the angle the lamp had been set for. He took the reading glasses off the cord around his neck and put them on. He studied the pearls. Whitmore Halsey III was watching him from the small mezzanine office above the floor. Whitmore was 52 years old. He had inherited the title of general manager from his father 7 years earlier and would inherit the chairmanship of Halsey Holdings Group from his father the moment his father stopped pretending he was still going to retire. Whitmore had graduated from Princeton with a degree in art history in 1994 and from Yale Law in 1997. He had been divorced for 9 years. He lived alone in a 4-bedroom Tudor on a cul-de-sac in Scarsdale. His mother had died 2 summers ago, and he had not cried at the funeral, a thing that bothered him in a way he could not entirely explain. Whitmore looked through the one-way glass panel at the man in the gray sweater. He ran a quick assessment that he had been running, in some version, since he was 19 years old behind the counter on weekends in college. Posture, fabric, watch, shoes, hands, the little finger of the left hand, the corner of a wallet visible in a back pocket or not. Whitmore was proud of how fast he could do this. He had once described it to a Princeton classmate at a dinner in Greenwich as reading the room before the room reads you. Today, the room told him this. A retired contractor. A man who had done well enough to live in Bronxville but not well enough to fit the floor. Someone who had probably wandered in to look at watches he could not afford. Someone whose presence on the floor at 3:47 on a Saturday in June, with 2 existing clients on the books for 4 o'clock, was a problem. Whitmore came down the carpeted staircase quietly. He crossed the floor with the unhurried gait he had practiced. He stopped 6 feet from the third display case. "Sir," he said. His voice was low and well-modulated, the voice of a man who had been trained at Yale Law to make a hostile motion sound like a courtesy. "I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have 2 private appointments arriving at 4 o'clock. Would you mind terribly stepping outside for a few minutes until we have an appropriate window to assist you?" There were 2 clients on the books for 4 o'clock. That part was true. There were also 4 other customers currently on the floor, none of whom were being attended to by any staff member, all of whom were white. There was a young couple at the cufflinks case. There was a woman in a tennis dress looking at earrings. There was Helen Vaccaro on the velvet bench. There was a man in a polo shirt examining a watch face under a loupe. None of them had been asked to step outside. None of them would be. The man in the gray sweater straightened up slowly. He took the reading glasses off and let them fall to the cord around his neck. He looked at Whitmore Halsey III for 1 full second. 2. 3. The store went very still. To understand what lived inside that stillness, you have to go back. Past the Oscars, past Broadway, past the films and the documentaries and the standing ovations. You have to go back to a small Pentecostal church on 3rd Street, in Mount Vernon, New York, in the spring of 1967, where a 12-year-old boy in a too-tight blue suit sat in the second pew on a hard wooden bench and listened to his father preach a sermon about a man named Joseph. Reverend Denzel Hayes Washington Sr. had been born in Buckingham County, Virginia, in 1909. He was a tall, narrow man with hands like dried tobacco leaves, and he worked 5 days a week for the New York City Water Department and stocked shelves on Saturday mornings at the S. Klein department store on Gertz Plaza, and he preached on Sunday afternoons to a congregation that sometimes numbered 8 people and sometimes numbered 11. He was, by every metric the world used to measure men, a small man living a small life. He was also the largest man his son would ever know. The Joseph sermon was a story Reverend Washington came back to twice a year, every year, because it was the story he had decided long ago contained everything a black man's son needed to understand about how to survive a country that would always be looking for a reason to send him outside. Joseph, the dreamer, sold by his brothers, lied about by the wife of his master, thrown into a pit, then into a prison, then forgotten there for years by men he had helped, until finally, by a turn nobody on earth could have engineered, he was lifted up to stand at the right hand of a pharaoh. But that was not the part Reverend Washington preached. The part he preached, the part he leaned over the pulpit to deliver in a voice that filled that small room like water filling a bowl, was this. When Joseph's brothers finally came begging for grain during the famine, and recognized him, and were terrified that he would destroy them, Joseph did not destroy them. He fed them. And then he said to them the line that Reverend Washington had built his whole life around. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The Reverend would pause there. He would look out across the 11 people in the pews. He would find his son's eyes in the second row. "Man gives the award," he would say, "but God gives the reward." Then he would let those words hang in the air. He would let them settle on his congregation like dust falling through a sunbeam. And he would say it again, slower, so that everyone in the room understood that this was not a poem. This was an instruction. Man gives the award, but God gives the reward. The boy in the second pew did not entirely understand what his father was saying. He understood the words. He did not yet understand the weight. But the words went into him in 1967, and they stayed. They stayed through his parents' divorce 2 years later. They stayed through his mother sending him to Oakland Military Academy in 1969 because the boys he was running with in Mount Vernon were on a road that would put 11 of them in prison before they turned 25. They stayed through Fordham University, where a one-eyed retired actor named Robinson Stone saw something in him and pulled him into the theater department. They stayed through every audition where he was told he was too tall, too dark, too serious, too much. They stayed through 1989 when he won his first Academy Award for Glory, and through 2002 when he won his second for Training Day, and through every year since. Man gives the award, God gives the reward. He had said it himself on a stage at the NAACP Image Awards in 2017, looking out at a room full of cameras. He had said it to his son John David before John David's first major film. He had said it quietly to himself in his car at 4 a.m. on the day his mother Lennis was buried in 2021. So on a Saturday afternoon in June of 2024, when a man in a navy blue suit looked at him and told him, very politely, to step outside, the words rose up in him the way they always did. They did not rise up as anger. They rose up as a kind of stillness that had been preparing for this moment for 57 years. Denzel Washington did not raise his voice. He did not introduce himself. He looked at Whitmore Halsey III for those 3 long seconds, and then he did something that several people in the room would later describe to investigators and to friends, and in one case to a grandchild 15 years from then, in almost identical words. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was not a hostile smile either. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed something he recognizes. The smile of a man who has read this script before. He smiled and he nodded once, very slowly, and he said, in a voice low enough that only Whitmore could hear it, "Yes, I imagine you would." That was all. 6 words. Yes, I imagine you would. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Now here is where the room cracked open. 20 feet behind the third display case, polishing a brass fitting with a microfiber cloth, stood a 21-year-old part-time sales associate named Elijah Mensah. Elijah had been working at Halsey Brothers for 19 months. He was a junior at Fordham University, theater program, full course load. a partial scholarship that covered tuition, but left him needing roughly $8,400 a semester for room and board and books. The job at Halsey paid him $18 an hour, plus a small commission, and he worked Friday evenings and Saturday afternoons for 26 hours a week. Elijah was born in Mount Vernon, New York, in 1903. His father, Kwame Mensah, had come to the United States from Accra, Ghana, in 1994 with $200 American in his shoe and a degree in mechanical engineering from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology that no employer in New York State would recognize. His mother, Adwoa, had trained as a nurse in Kumasi and was now a certified nursing assistant at Westchester Medical Center, working the 7 to 3 shift 4 days a week. Kwame drove an Uber from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning and worked as a security guard at the same hospital where Adwoa worked from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. They overlapped at home for 40 minutes a day. They had been married for 28 years. When Elijah was 12, in the spring of 2015, his father had done a thing that the family was still paying for in small ways. Kwame had taken $312 out of the emergency envelope under the mattress and bought 2 tickets to a Saturday matinee performance of August Wilson's Fences on Broadway. Cheap tickets, second balcony, last row, wooden seats so old they creaked when you sat down. Father and son had taken the Metro North down from Mount Vernon, walked from Grand Central to the Court Theater on West 46th Street, and sat in the dark for 2 hours and 40 minutes watching a black man named Troy Maxson stand in a backyard in Pittsburgh in 1957 and try to tell his son why he had built a fence that would never be finished. The black man playing Troy that afternoon was Denzel Washington. Elijah was 12 years old. He had never seen a black man stand at the center of anything before. He had never seen anyone of any color hold an audience the way Denzel held that audience that afternoon, with a quiet you could have walked across. When the curtain came down, the boy sat in his seat for a long minute and did not move. His father, who almost never touched him in public, put a hand on the back of his neck and said one sentence in Twi. "Woho ye fi, you are beautiful." That was the day Elijah decided he was going to be an actor. 3 years later, in the fall of 2021, when Elijah was 17 and a senior at Mount Vernon High School, his father Kwame had walked into Halsey Brothers Jewelers, carrying his old Casio digital watch, the band of which had finally snapped after 13 years of daily wear. Kwame did not know that Halsey Brothers did not service Casios. He just knew it was a watch store, and he was walking past, and he had 10 minutes before his shift. And he was a man who liked to do the polite thing and ask. He had walked through the door wearing his security guard uniform, navy blue with reflective stripes, his name patch on the chest, and a sales associate Elijah did not recognize had looked at him for 2 seconds and said, "Sir, this is not the right store for that. There is a kiosk in the mall." Kwame had stood there for a moment. He had nodded in a way Elijah would remember for the rest of his life. He had thanked the sales associate. He had walked out. That had been 3 years ago. 3 months later, Elijah had been hired at Halsey Brothers as a part-time associate because they needed someone who could speak to younger customers, and Elijah was articulate and well-dressed and willing to work Saturdays. He had not told them his father had been turned away from their counter. He had not told his father he had been hired. The job was a secret his father did not know about for the first 8 months, until Adwoa accidentally told him. And his father, when he found out, had said one sentence in English which he only used for serious things. "Do the job well. They are not your friends." That sentence had lived in Elijah for 2 years and 6 months. It rose up in him now at 3:48 on a Saturday afternoon in June of 2024. As he watched Whitmore Halsey III turn his back on the man in the gray sweater and walk back toward the staircase to the mezzanine, as though the matter had been concluded. Elijah set the cloth down on the counter. He took one breath in, he held it. He stepped forward. "Mr. Washington." The 2 words came out cleaner than his heartbeat had any right to allow. They crossed the silent floor like a stone skipping across still water and landed exactly where Elijah had aimed them. The young couple at the cufflinks case looked up. The woman in the tennis dress turned. The man with the loop set it down. Helen Vaccaro on the velvet bench drew in a small, sharp breath. Whitmore Halsey III stopped on the second step of the staircase. He did not turn around for one full second. too. When he did turn around, his face had gone through a very small, very specific change. Not embarrassment, not yet. Something that looked for a moment almost like recalculation. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The man in the gray sweater, who had reached the door and put his hand on the brass handle, stopped. He turned. He looked at Elijah. There are moments between two strangers that don't have a name in any language. Not recognition, not gratitude. Something older than that. The look passed between Elijah Mensa and Denzel Washington for perhaps 2 seconds, but it carried in it the full weight of an apology Elijah's father had never received, and an offer Elijah's father had never been made, and a fence in a Pittsburgh backyard that would never be finished. Both men felt it move through them at the same time, the way two tuning forks struck against the same wood will vibrate at the same frequency without ever touching. Elijah walked around the counter. His hands were steady. His rent was due in 12 days. He had $317 in his checking account. He had a $32 copay, overdue at his mother's clinic, from when he had pulled a muscle in his back lifting boxes. He thought about all of these things in the space of 1 second, very clearly. And then he thought about his father, standing in the security guard uniform, thanking the sales associate who had told him to leave. He kept walking. "Sir," he said to the man in the gray sweater, "my name is Elijah. I would be very honored to show you the necklace." Whitmore came down off the staircase very fast. "Elijah." His voice carried a thin steel edge that hadn't been there with the customer. "A word." In one moment, Mr. Halsey. Elijah did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the man in the sweater. "I just want to show this gentleman the Akoya strand he was looking at. Then I'm all yours." Helen Vaccaro on the bench did something then that no one expected. The 78-year-old Italian widow, whose husband had been a New York City police officer for 41 years, who had buried him in 2019 and had not raised her voice to a stranger since the funeral, stood up from the bench. She crossed the floor. She walked past Whitmore Halsey III as though he were a piece of furniture. She stopped beside Elijah at the third display case. "I would also like to be helped," she said, looking directly at Denzel. "And I would like Elijah to help me, whenever he is finished with this gentleman." Whitmore stood in the middle of the floor with his hands at his sides. His face had gone the color of unbaked dough. Denzel Washington walked back from the door. He walked slowly, but he walked. He stopped at the display case. He put the reading glasses back on. He looked at Elijah Mensa, and then at the elderly Italian woman, and then at the Akoya pearls on their bed of cream velvet, and he said something so quietly that only Elijah heard it. "Son," he said, "tell me about these pearls." Elijah Mensa, 21 years old, part-time sales associate, son of Kwame and Adwoa, who had been preparing for this exact moment without knowing it for 9 years and 1 month, who had read every catalog Halsey Brothers had ever published, who had taught himself the difference between an Akoya and a South Sea and a freshwater pearl on his subway commutes between Mount Vernon and the Lincoln Center campus of Fordham, took a breath. And then he did what his father had told him to do. He did the job well. He talked about the pearls. He talked about the small Japanese island town of Toba, where Akoya pearls were first cultured by a man named Mikamoto in 1893, who lost his entire first harvest to a red tide and then started over. He talked about the way an Akoya gets its color, the very faint pink rose overtone that only develops in the right water at the right temperature with the right slow patience. He talked about why this particular strand, a hand-knotted single strand of 18.5-inch length, 53 pearls of 7.5 millimeter, with a rose gold sliding cluster engraved on the back with a tiny Halsey Brothers seal, was the kind of necklace you bought for the second 40 years of a marriage, not the first. Denzel listened. He did not interrupt. He looked at the necklace, and then he looked at Elijah's face, and then back at the necklace. He reached out one hand. He touched the strand with one finger, very lightly. The same way, 8 years earlier, his wife Pauletta had touched a magazine photograph of a single strand of pearls that her mother had once owned and lost in a house fire in Newark in 1962, and never spoken about again. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "How much?" he said. $23,400, sir." Elijah's voice was even. "Plus tax. I'll take it." Whitmore Halsey III had not moved from the middle of the floor. His mouth was open. His left hand was making small, involuntary movements at his side, as though searching for something to hold. Elijah completed the paperwork. He did it with the precise, slow care of a young man who knew, in the back of his mind, that this was the last sale he would ever make at Halsey Brothers Jewelers. He wrapped the necklace in its box. Black lacquered, silk-lined, the small brass HB monogram pressed flat into the lid. He tied the cream silk ribbon. He placed the box into a soft black velvet pouch, then into a small shopping bag with cord handles. He handed the bag to Denzel Washington. The man in the sweater took the bag in both hands. He looked at Elijah, not at the bag. "Thank you," he said, "for doing your job." 6 words, plain as river water. The same 6 words a different man had said to a different young salesperson on a different street 12 years earlier in a different state. Although neither Denzel nor Elijah knew that. Helen Vaccaro, by the counter, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. Denzel walked to the door. Curtis Beaumont, watching through the glass, opened it from the outside before Denzel reached for it. The bell rang. The man in the gray sweater paused on the threshold. He looked back once, not at Whitmore, at Elijah. Then he stepped into the June sun. The door closed. The bell rang again on its second oscillation. The room exhaled. 31 minutes later, Elijah Mensah was called into the mezzanine office. Whitmore did not stand up from his desk. He did not offer Elijah a chair. He spoke for 1 minute and 40 seconds in language that was very careful and very HR clean. Insubordination. Failure to follow management direction in front of customers. Restructuring of weekend staffing. A small severance representing 2 weeks of pay. Elijah listened. He nodded. He collected his jacket and his Metro card from his locker. He walked out onto Pondfield Road at 4:40 in the afternoon. The June light was soft and yellow on the stone facades. The bookshop owner was still on his stoop. The smell of lavender was still drifting from the soap shop. The black SUV that had been parked in front of the store was gone. Elijah stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He had $317 in his checking account. His rent was due in 12 days. He had no job, and the spring semester at Fordham started in 11 weeks, and he did not know where $8,400 was going to come from. He felt strangely, completely at peace. What the world did not know about Denzel Washington, what the cameras and the late-night interviews and the box office numbers never captured, was what he did in the long, quiet hours between projects when no one was looking. He had, by June of 2024, given away more than $70 million over the course of his career. Most of it never showed up in headlines. He had paid the tuition for 14 students at the Boys and Girls Club of Mount Vernon since 1995, students he had never met, whose names he asked the program director not to share with him because he didn't want to make it about him. He had paid for the funeral of a teenage boy in Yonkers in 2008 after reading about the shooting in a community paper, and had asked the funeral home not to mention his name. He had given over $250,000 to the family of a Marine corporal from Newark who had been killed in Helmand Province in 2011, money that arrived in the form of a check from a small foundation called the Lennis Washington Memorial Trust, named for his mother. He had been raised by a Pentecostal minister who had preached for 38 years to congregations of fewer than 15 people, and a beautician mother who had cut hair for 47 years, standing on her feet for 10 hours a day in 3 different shops in Mount Vernon and the Bronx, and the 2 of them had taught him, before he was old enough to, that the only money that is yours is the money you give away before anyone knows you have it. That night, at his home in Toluca Lake, Denzel sat in his study for a long time. He did not turn on the television. He did not look at his phone. He thought about the smell of his father's church on a humid spring evening, dust and old hymnals, and the cheap aftershave the Reverend wore on Sundays. He thought about a young man in a store who had stepped forward at the cost of a job and had done it without performing it for anyone. He thought about an Italian widow who had stood up from a bench and refused to be sorted. And he thought about Whitmore Halsey III. He thought about him the way Joseph in his father's sermon had thought about his brothers, not with hatred, with the long, slow patience of a man who had already decided what he was going to do, and who knew exactly how long it was going to take. He picked up the phone. He called a lawyer in New York named Carl Lindemann, who had represented him in matters of investment and trust for 19 years. "Carl," he said, "I need you to look into something. There's a holding company in New York called Halsey Holdings Group. They own a small chain of jewelry stores, 17 locations. I want to know how the stock is structured. I want to know how much of it is publicly available and how much of it the family still controls. I want a full picture by Thursday. Carl said he would have it by Wednesday. Denzel set the phone down. He looked out the window at the dark canyon and the pinprick lights of the houses across it. He was not planning revenge. Revenge is a small thing, fast and hot and gone in a week. He was planning something else. He was planning what his father would have called a witness. A long, slow, public, unmistakable witness made not for the man in the navy suit, but for everyone who would walk through that door for the next 50 years. What happened next did not happen fast. While Denzel waited for Carl Lindemann's report, the world above the surface did what the world always does. It caught fire briefly. It burned hot. It moved on. A 34-year-old lifestyle blogger named Margot Stein, who lived in Bronxville and ran a small Substack called the Penfield Edit, had been at the cufflinks case with her boyfriend that Saturday afternoon. She had watched the entire scene. She had taken no photographs and no video. But that night, sitting at the kitchen counter of her one-bedroom apartment with a glass of wine, she wrote a 200-word post titled simply, "Did anyone else just see Denzel Washington get asked to leave Halsey Brothers?" The post went up at 11:47 p.m. on Saturday. By Monday morning, it had been shared 63,000 times. By Tuesday, it was on the local news. By Wednesday, it was national. The hashtag Justice for Denzel trended on what people still occasionally called Twitter for 36 hours. Halsey Holdings Group put out a statement on Thursday morning. It used the phrase "appears to have been a regrettable misunderstanding." It used the phrase "inconsistent with our brand values." It announced that Whitmore Halsey III had been placed on a brief administrative leave pending an internal review. 21 days later, with the news cycle gone, Whitmore was quietly reinstated. The internal review, conducted by a firm that had been retained by his father, found no actionable evidence of discriminatory intent. Most of America assumed the story was over. A small number of people in the room that Saturday assumed the same. Helen Vaccaro, the Italian widow, did not. She had clipped Margot Stein's Substack post and printed it out at her local library. She kept it in a manila folder in the second drawer of her writing desk, next to the program from her husband's funeral. She did not know exactly what she was waiting for. She knew there was something more. Elijah Mensa did not assume it was over either. He had received, 8 days after he was fired, a hand-delivered envelope at his studio apartment in the Belmont neighborhood of the Bronx, 6 blocks from Fordham's Rose Hill campus. The envelope was plain. There was no return address. Inside was a letter on a single piece of heavy cream paper, written in a hand Elijah did not recognize. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. It thanked him. It told him that the work he had done that afternoon had been seen, that it had been understood, and that the cost it had carried was understood as well. It said that what he had stepped forward to do was rarer than people knew, and worth more than people paid for, and that the writer hoped to be part of making sure he never had to weigh that kind of step against rent again. The letter did not include a check. The letter said that a representative would be in touch. It was signed with one initial. D. Elijah called his father. He read the letter to Kwame slowly over the phone, in English all 4 paragraphs, while his father sat on the small concrete balcony of the apartment in Mount Vernon, where the family had lived since 2008. When Elijah finished, the line was quiet for a long time. Then his father said something in Twi, "Onyama dewo aboa." God has come for you. Elijah did not sleep that night. The representative came on a Thursday. Her name was Frances Okoye. She was a 46-year-old program director for a foundation called Mundy Lane, which Elijah had never heard of, but which a quick search would tell anyone was the production and philanthropy arm associated with a particular 2-time Academy Award-winning actor. Frances met Elijah at a small coffee shop in the Bronx. She did not bring contracts. She brought a notepad. She asked him what he needed, not what he wanted. What he needed to finish his junior year, to get through his senior year, to not have to choose between rent and books, to not have to send money home to his mother for the copay she was hiding from his father. He told her. She wrote it down. 3 weeks later, Elijah received a confirmation from Fordham's financial aid office. The Lennis Washington Endowed Scholarship in the Arts, which had quietly existed at Fordham since 2011 but had not previously been awarded to a theater student, had been redirected for the next 2 academic years to fully fund his tuition, room, board, books, and a modest monthly stipend. There was also a small note from Francis. The note said that when he graduated, there would be a paid apprenticeship waiting for him at Mundy Lane Entertainment in Los Angeles, if he wanted it, with no obligation and no strings, and that someone would call him in 18 months to see. This part of the story would never be in the newspapers, not because it was hidden, because the people involved had agreed it would not be told. What was in the newspapers eventually was something different, something that started with a single line in a Securities and Exchange Commission filing. Naomi Reinhart was 31 years old. She worked the financial beat at the Westchester Journal-News, which is a fancy way of saying that her job mostly consisted of reading documents that no one else read and looking for the small flicker in the spreadsheet that meant something. She had a degree from Northwestern in journalism and had once interned at a financial firm in Manhattan called Lindemann Capital Management, where she had met a senior partner named Carl Lindemann who had been kind to her and had written her a recommendation letter that helped her get her current job. In late October of 2024, 16 weeks after the Saturday afternoon at Halsey Brothers, Naomi was reading the previous week's Schedule 13D filings. A Schedule 13D is required to be filed with the SEC whenever any individual or group acquires more than 5% of a publicly traded company. Most 13D filings are uninteresting. Pension fund moves, activist hedge funds buying into midcaps. Naomi read them every Tuesday morning because that was her job. That Tuesday, one of the filings caught her eye. The acquiring party was a Delaware-registered entity called Hayes Riverbend Holdings, LLC. The target was a small holding company called Halsey Holdings Group, parent of a New York jewelry chain. The position acquired was 3%, filed October 28, 2024. Value of position, just over $11.2 million. Naomi looked at the filing. The name of the acquiring entity meant nothing to her. Hayes Riverbend Holdings, LLC. She pulled the formation documents from the Delaware Secretary of State's website. The entity had been formed 7 weeks earlier. The registered agent was a service company in Wilmington that handled thousands of LLCs. The manager listed on the filing was a Manhattan attorney named Carl Lindemann. Naomi sat back in her chair. She knew Carl Lindemann. Carl Lindemann had written her recommendation letter in 2017. Carl Lindemann did not file 13Ds on small jewelry holding companies. Carl Lindemann represented 2 clients she knew of by name, both of whom were on every list of the wealthiest Black Americans in the country. One of them had recently been the subject of a viral story about being asked to leave a store in Bronxville. She picked up her phone. She called Carl Lindemann's office. She was put through. "Carl, it's Naomi Reinhart at the Journal-News. I'm looking at a Schedule 13D filing for Halsey Holdings Group, filed by Hayes Riverbend Holdings. You're the manager of record. I have one question. Is your client willing to comment on the acquisition?" There was a pause on the line. Then Carl Lindemann said, in the voice she remembered from the firm, very pleasant and very controlled, "Naomi, good to hear from you. My client is not commenting. But I will tell you, off the record, that you are an excellent reporter and you have a story. Off the record only. We clear?" She was clear. She started digging. She dug for 16 days. What she found, by November 7, 2024, was a chain of decisions and documents that would, when she published her piece on the front page of the Sunday edition under the headline, "What Denzel Washington Did About Bronxville," set in motion the second and far larger collapse of Whitmore Halsey III's life. The Schedule 13D was the visible piece, Hayes Riverbend Holdings, which the SEC filing made unmistakably traceable back to a trust controlled by Denzel Washington and his wife Pauletta, held 3% of Halsey Holdings Group. That position came with a seat on the Strategic Advisory Committee, which was a board-level advisory body the Halsey family had created in 2009 to court outside investors. Carl Lindemann had negotiated, as a condition of the investment, that one named representative of Hayes Riverbend would be permitted to attend all advisory committee meetings as a non-voting observer with full document access. That representative would be a Mundy Lane Foundation officer named Francis Okoye. But that was only the visible piece. The piece that made Naomi sit back at her desk at 11 o'clock at night in the empty newsroom and stare at the ceiling. For almost a full minute was the second piece. In the 7 weeks between the Bronxville incident and the formation of Hayes Riverbend Holdings, a small audit firm in White Plains had been quietly retained by an unnamed party to conduct mystery shopper visits to Halsey Brothers Jewelers. 3 separate visits, on 3 separate Saturdays, by 3 separate individuals. The mystery shoppers were not undercover federal agents. They were not journalists. They were professional actors. All 3 were black. All 3 had been dressed in clothing similar to what Denzel had worn. All 3 had been instructed to enter the store, browse the display cases, and document the staff response. All 3 had been asked to leave, by the same manager, with variations of the same phrasing. One of the 3, a 38-year-old stage actress named Imani Foster, who had played Ophelia at the Public Theater in 2019, had carried a small audio recorder in her handbag. The audio recorder had been running when Whitmore Halsey III, 20 minutes after asking her to wait outside, had stood at the back office speaking to his assistant manager and had been recorded saying 8 specific words. "I know which customers belong on my floor." The audio was 11 seconds long. The 8 words were unmistakable. Naomi listened to it 3 times in her car in the newsroom parking lot. She drove home. She did not sleep that night either. The story ran on Sunday, November 10, 2024. By Monday afternoon, Whitmore Halsey III had been terminated, not placed on leave. Terminated with cause by unanimous vote of the Halsey Holdings Group Board of Directors, which now included a non-voting observer from Hayes Riverbend Holdings sitting in the corner of the boardroom in a charcoal pantsuit, quietly take notes, who said nothing during the entire meeting and was not introduced by name. Whitmore did not apologize. He never would. He told a reporter from the Journal News, in his only on-record statement, that he had been made an example of in a moment of unfortunate publicity. His father, Edmund Halsey Sr., declined to comment for any story for the remainder of his life. The Civil Rights Division of the New York State Attorney General's office opened an investigation. 3 former Halsey Brothers customers, including a black emergency room physician from White Plains who had been asked to leave the same Bronxville store in 2018, came forward with sworn affidavits. A settlement was announced in March of 2025 that required Halsey Holdings to implement a customer equity training program developed in partnership with Fordham University's theater department, taught using a method called participatory dramaturgy, in which sales associates would, twice a year, sit on the receiving end of scripted scenarios written by black playwrights and performed by professional actors. The program would be funded, in perpetuity, by the Mundy Lane Foundation. The man who designed the curriculum, working under contract with Fordham, was Robinson Stone, Jr., the son of the one-eyed retired actor who had pulled Denzel out of a Fordham journalism class and into the theater 50 years earlier. Some loops close late, but they do close. What Naomi Reinhardt did not put in the article because she did not know about it was the 4th thing. In April of 2025, 10 months after the afternoon at Halsey Brothers, a man named Kwame Mensessa, age 58, security guard at Westchester Medical Center and Uber driver and father of one, received a letter in his mailbox at the apartment on East Lincoln Avenue in Mount Vernon. The letter was on cream paper. It was from a small cloud program called the Kwame Mensa Engineering Pathway Fund, administered through the Mount Vernon Boys and Girls Club. The fund, the letter explained, had been established 2 months earlier with an initial endowment of $2.1 million. It would provide, beginning in the fall of 2025 and continuing in perpetuity, full 4-year engineering scholarships at any accredited university in the state of New York for 12 children of West African immigrant families from Mount Vernon and the surrounding Westchester County area each year. The fund had been named, the letter explained, after a local resident whose quiet excellence and integrity had been recognized by an admirer who wished to remain unnamed. Kwame Mensa read the letter twice, then a 3rd time. He put it down on the kitchen table. He sat in his work uniform, navy blue with reflective stripes, the same uniform he had been wearing 19 years earlier when a sales associate at a jewelry store in Bronxville had asked him to leave, and he wept. He wept for 10 minutes, very quietly, the way a man weeps when he has spent 30 years not crying. His wife, Adwoa, who was sleeping in the bedroom before her overnight shift, woke and came into the kitchen in her nightgown. She read the letter. She put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "Kwam," she said. "Tell me again. Tell me what the words say." He read it to her in English, then translated each sentence into Twi. When he came to the part that said, whose quiet excellence and integrity had been recognized, he could not get through it. His wife finished the sentence for him. "Onyam ahu wo. God has seen you." 6 weeks later, Kwamps received a phone call from a woman named Frances Okoye. She asked, very politely, if he and his wife would be willing to attend a small ceremony in May at the Mount Vernon Boys and Girls Club to formally launch the scholarship in his name. There would be no press. There would be roughly 40 people in the room. The anonymous donor, she said, would be there. The anonymous donor would like very much to shake Mr. Mensah's hand. The ceremony was held on May 18, 2025. It was a small room with folding chairs and a card table covered in a paper tablecloth and a sheet cake from the bakery on Grammaton Avenue. The donor arrived without an entourage. He wore a charcoal gray wool sweater, dark khakis, brown Oxfords, and reading glasses on a tortoiseshell cord around his neck. He stood at the back of the room during the announcement. When Kwame Mensah was called to the front and presented with a framed copy of the scholarship's founding charter, the donor walked up the aisle. He took Kwame's hand. He held it for a long moment. "Sir," he said, in a voice low enough that only Kwame and his wife could hear it, "I am very sorry that you were not seen 3 years ago in that store. I am very sorry that this country has so often failed to see men like you. My father was a man like you. He worked for the New York City Water Department for 31 years. He preached on Sunday afternoons to a room of 8 people. He was the largest man I ever knew, and nobody ever named a scholarship for him while he was alive. Today I get to name one for you." Kwame Mensah could not speak. He simply held on to the man's hand. "You raised a good son, Mr. Mensah," Denzel Washington said. "He stepped forward when most men, my age, his age, anybody's age, would not have. You did that, you and your wife. I just wanted to come back to Mount Vernon to say thank you." Outside, on the wall of the Boys and Girls Club building, was a small bronze plaque that had been installed in 1968. It was inscribed with a verse. It read, "Whoever is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much." Denzel had walked past that plaque every day for 12 years of his childhood. He had not thought of it in 50 years until he walked up to the building that morning and saw it again. That is the story. Almost. Whitmore Halsey III sold his tutor in Scarsdale in the summer of 2025 and moved to a rental apartment in a smaller town up the Hudson. He took a position as a consultant at a mid-sized retail group in Stamford. He did not, then or later, apologize for what he had said on a Saturday afternoon in Bronxville. He told a friend at a small dinner party in 2026 that he had been scapegoated by the politics of a particular moment. The friend did not invite him back. Elijah Mensah graduated from Fordham University in the spring of 2026 with a Bachelor of Arts in Theater. He had a 4-year scholarship in his pocket and an apprenticeship waiting in Los Angeles. And he flew out the week after graduation. By 2030, he would be an Obie-winning playwright. By 2034, he would write a play, performed at the Public Theater, called The Necklace, which would run for 82 performances and win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. He would dedicate the play, in print and from the stage on opening night, to 2 men, his father Kwame Mensah, and a man identified only by initials D.H. W. Helen Vaccaro framed Naomi Reinhardt's Sunday article and hung it in her living room. She told her granddaughter it was there to remind her of something her late husband, the police officer, had believed his whole life, that silence in the right hands is the loudest possible sound. Pauletta Washington opened the small black lacquered box on the morning of June 25, 2024, in the kitchen of their home in Toluca Lake. She did not cry. She held the strand of Akoya pearls in both hands for a long time. Then she looked at her husband across the table. "Denzel," she said. "You remembered." He nodded. "I always remember," he said. She wore the necklace every day for the rest of that summer, and in the small velvet pouch the necklace had come in, tucked inside the black lacquered box, There was a slip of cream paper Pauletta did not find until October. The paper had 4 words written in her husband's hand. She kept it for the rest of her life. Man gives the award. And on a Sunday afternoon in late June of 2024, at a Pentecostal church on 3rd Street in Mount Vernon, New York, where a small congregation of 11 people had gathered to remember a reverend who had died 33 years earlier, the visiting speaker was a 69-year-old man in a dark suit who had driven up from Manhattan that morning. He stood at the pulpit. He looked out at the room. He said one sentence that the people in that room would talk about for the rest of their lives. "My father told me that man gives the award, but God gives the reward. I have spent my whole life trying to live like that was true, and I have found every single time that it is." Then he sat down, and the bell in the small steeple above the church rang 4 times, marking the hour of 3, and somewhere 2 miles north of there, on the corner of 72 Pondfield Road in Bronxville, the door of a jewelry store opened, and a customer walked in, and was greeted by a new young woman behind the counter, who had completed her Fordham customer equity training 3 weeks earlier, and who said, very simply and with her full attention, "Welcome to Halsey Brothers. How can I help you today?" That is the whole story. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments below where you are watching this from. What city, what country, what corner of the world? Tell me your father's name. Tell me the one sentence he gave you that you have carried with you for your whole life. I read them, all of them. They mean more than you know. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that dignity is not what other people give you, but what you carry with you when no one is looking, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second. It helps this story find one more person who needs to hear it today. And if you believe that quiet decisions in quiet rooms can change everything, that one young man stepping forward when nobody is watching can rearrange the entire shape of a life, then subscribe to this channel. That is exactly what we are here for. Story after story, reminder after reminder, about who we are capable of being when it counts the most. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The next story is already waiting for you. And trust me, after this one, you are going to want to see it.